In a quiet town on the edge of the Colorado Plains, there lived a man named Caleb. He was a master carpenter, known for his steady hands and the way he could turn plain pieces of wood into something extraordinary. Doors that swung open as smooth as water, tables that felt like they'd been carved from the heart of the forest. People came from miles around for his work. But Caleb had one flaw, and it was costing him everything. He could never get out of bed in the morning. Every evening, Caleb would promise himself, "Tomorrow, I'll wake up early. I'll get a jump on my orders." And every morning, when his alarm rang, he reached out, smacked the snooze button, and pulled the blanket tighter around him. "What's another hour?" he told himself. "I work late anyway." But 1 hour turned into 2. And by the time Caleb finally dragged himself out of bed, the sun was high and the day was already slipping away. At first, it didn't seem to matter. He worked late into the night, often by candlelight, catching up on orders. But slowly, things began to fall apart. He missed delivery deadlines. He was late for meetings with clients. And when the town council asked him to build the stage for the spring festival, the most important event of the year, he overslept and never showed up to discuss the designs. The job was handed to someone else. That night, as Caleb sat alone in his workshop, running his fingers over an unfinished piece of oak, he realized he was falling behind. His father used to tell him, "The world doesn't wait for you. You either keep up or you watch it pass you by." Caleb was starting to understand what that meant. A few days later, his grandfather came to visit. The old man had once been a farmer, waking before dawn every day of his life. He found Caleb asleep at his workbench, a cold cup of coffee sitting next to his hand. Late night again, his grandfather asked, sitting down across from him. Caleb rubbed his eyes. "Couldn't sleep. Too much on my mind." The old man smiled. "Too much on your mind, or too much time wasted in the morning?" Caleb sighed. "I've tried, Grandpa. I set alarms, I make promises. I just can't seem to do it." His grandfather nodded slowly, as if he'd heard these words before. Then he leaned in. "Let me tell you a story. Years ago, in a village not far from here, there were 2 hunters, Thomas and Eli. Both were skilled, both had fine bows and sharp arrows. But they had one difference. Thomas woke before the sun. He was in the forest as the first light touched the trees. He moved quietly, and by the time the animals stirred, he was already in place. Eli, on the other hand, loved his warm bed. He rose when the sun was high and the forest was busy. His prey had already moved on, wary and alert. At the end of each day, Thomas returned with game and fresh meat for his family. Eli often came back empty-handed, blaming bad luck or tricky weather. But it wasn't luck, it was time. Thomas understood that nature has its own clock, and if you don't move with it, you fall behind. Caleb listened, staring at his grandfather's lined face, thinking about all the times he'd told himself there was still time. All the mornings he'd let slip away. What happened to Eli? Caleb asked quietly. His grandfather smiled faintly. Eventually, Eli had to learn to rise with the sun, or be left behind. That night, Caleb made a decision, not a promise, a decision. He set his alarm for 5:30 a.m. and placed it across the room, far from his bed. When it rang, his body screamed at him to go back to sleep, but he forced himself up, splashed cold water on his face, and stepped outside. For weeks, Caleb kept it up. He went to bed earlier. He stopped wasting time scrolling on his phone at night. Each morning, he rose before the sun, and each morning, he found himself getting more done before breakfast than he used to by noon. The work improved. He wasn't rushed anymore. He sanded every piece of wood until it was like silk beneath his fingers. His customers noticed. They smiled when he delivered orders early. Word spread. When the next festival came around, the council didn't ask anyone else. They came straight to Caleb. This time, he was ready. He built a stage so sturdy and beautiful that people from nearby towns came just to see it. Carved into the beams were delicate patterns of birds taking flight at dawn, a quiet reminder to himself of why he now rose early. Months turned into years. Caleb became the most respected craftsman in the region. People would ask him his secret, expecting some trick or shortcut, but he always gave them the same answer. I stopped chasing time. I started chasing the sunrise. One evening, sitting beside his grandfather, watching the sky turn gold and crimson, Caleb said, "You were right. The morning changes everything." His grandfather chuckled. "The morning doesn't change anything, Caleb. You do." And Caleb understood. The world didn't wait. But if you woke with the sun, if you moved with it instead of against it, life opened doors you never thought possible.